Got accused of cheating for years. Found out the real reason was closer to home than I ever imagined. I spent years being accused of cheating, only to find out she was projecting the whole time. I genuinely believed my marriage was stable for a long time, which is probably why I ignored the warning signs for much longer than I should have. Looking back now, there were so many moments that feel painfully obvious in hindsight, but at the time, I kept convincing myself that my wife was simply insecure, stressed, or overthinking things. We lived in a fairly small apartment complex where everybody knew each other at least a little, and one of our neighbors happened to be an extremely outgoing person. She would greet everyone, start conversations with basically anybody she passed in the hallway, and always acted overly friendly in a way that stood out compared to everyone else living there. According to her, she had grown up in a very isolated, rural area without neighbors nearby and had struggled socially because she was an only child. So once she moved somewhere more populated, she tried hard to connect with people around her. Honestly, I never thought much about it. I was polite back because that is just how I was raised. At first, my wife would joke about it. She would smirk and ask if I had a crush on the neighbor whenever she saw us talking outside or laughing. During casual conversations, I always brushed it off because the idea sounded ridiculous to me. I barely knew the woman beyond normal neighbor interactions. But after a while, the jokes slowly stopped sounding like jokes. The comments became more frequent, more aggressive, and eventually turned into direct accusations that something inappropriate was happening behind her back. It completely caught me off guard because there was genuinely nothing going on. I tried explaining myself calmly over and over again, but every explanation somehow turned into another argument. She would point out tiny, meaningless details as proof, like how long I spoke to the neighbor in the parking lot or how I smiled during conversations. At some point, it started feeling less like jealousy and more like she wanted me to confess to something that never even happened. The weirdest part was how obsessed she became with it. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Every small disagreement somehow circled back to the same accusations. Eventually, I stopped trying to defend myself emotionally and started looking at the situation logically instead. I remember sitting there one night, completely exhausted after another argument, realizing none of this behavior made sense unless something deeper was going on. I finally snapped and told her that there were only 3 possible explanations left. Either she secretly wanted me to actually cheat, she was cheating herself and projecting her guilt onto me, or something was seriously wrong with the way she was thinking. I even jokingly exaggerated how absurd the accusations were by saying, if she brought it up again, I might as well move the neighbor into our apartment, start a whole new life, and completely lean into the insanity of the accusations. It was meant to break the tension, but after that conversation, something changed. Almost overnight, she stopped bringing the neighbor up entirely. For a while, I actually believed we had moved past it. Things became calmer between us, and life went back to normal on the surface. But now, years later, I realized the silence should have scared me more than the accusations ever did. After that night, everything seemed strangely peaceful, almost too peaceful. The accusations completely disappeared, and for the first time in years it felt like I could finally relax inside my own home without worrying that some random conversation with a neighbor or coworker would somehow turn into another argument. My wife acted calmer, more affectionate even, and because I wanted our marriage to work so badly, I accepted the sudden change without questioning it too deeply. Looking back now, I think part of me was simply relieved to escape the constant tension. When you spend years defending yourself against something you never did, eventually silence starts to feel like a reward. Life moved forward the way life usually does. We got busy with work, responsibilities, bills, family events, and all the small routines that slowly blur years together before you even notice how much time has passed. The neighbor eventually moved away, and that entire chapter faded into the background of my memory. Every now and then, I would remember how intense my wife's accusations used to be, but I convinced myself it had probably just been insecurity mixed with stress. I wanted a simple explanation because the alternative was uncomfortable to think about. Around that same time, one of our mutual friends started spending more time around us. He had already been part of our social circle for years, so nothing about it seemed unusual at first. He was the type of guy everybody trusted easily, helpful, funny, always available whenever someone needed a favor. He came over for dinners, helped us move furniture once, watched games with me on weekends, and honestly became such a normal part of our lives that I stopped noticing how often he was around. If someone had told me back then that he would eventually become the person to destroy my marriage, I probably would have laughed in their face. But when I think back carefully now, there were moments that bother me, tiny things I ignored, because I never imagined betrayal could happen so close to me. Sometimes conversations would suddenly stop when I entered the room. Sometimes my wife seemed oddly defensive whenever I casually mentioned him. There were nights she acted distant for no clear reason, only to become unusually cheerful after texting someone for hours. I noticed these things individually, but never connected them together, because trust has a way of blinding you. Once you fully trust someone, your brain automatically searches for innocent explanations instead of painful ones. The worst part is that I actually defended both of them constantly. Friends would occasionally joke about how close they seemed, and I would immediately shut it down because I thought those comments were disrespectful. I trusted my wife. I trusted my friend. In my mind, suspicion itself felt uglier than ignorance. I genuinely believed that if you loved someone properly, you should give them trust instead of paranoia. Ironically, the only person in the relationship who constantly accused someone of cheating was the one hiding secrets the entire time. Then came the night everything collapsed. To this day, I still replay it in my head, sometimes wondering if there was a moment where I could have turned around and avoided finding out altogether. But reality does not work like that. Once something is true, it stays true whether you discover it or not. And unfortunately for me, I discovered it in the worst way possible. That night started out completely normal, which honestly made everything feel even more disturbing afterward. I had been out later than expected because of work-related issues, and I remember being annoyed more than anything else during the drive home. I was tired, hungry, and already thinking about going straight to bed. Once I got inside, nothing felt unusual when I pulled into the parking lot. No dramatic feeling, no instinct telling me something was wrong, nothing like people describe in movies. It was just another ordinary night right before my entire life changed. When I walked into the apartment, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt, almost unnaturally quiet. Usually the television would be on somewhere in the background, or I would hear movement from another room, but instead the place felt frozen. At first I assumed my wife had simply gone to sleep early, but then I noticed a few small details that immediately made my stomach tighten. There were shoes near the entrance that did not belong to me. Familiar shoes. Shoes I had seen countless times before. I wish I could say I handled what happened next calmly, but the truth is my brain almost refused to process what I was seeing. There is a strange moment when reality feels so wrong that your mind tries to reject it before accepting it. I walked further into the apartment, hoping I was misunderstanding something, hoping there was some innocent explanation waiting for me around the corner. Instead, I found my wife and our mutual friend together in a situation that destroyed every benefit of the doubt instantly. In a single moment, years of trust collapsed so hard, it almost felt physical. Nobody noticed me at first. That is honestly the part that stayed with me the longest. The sheer carelessness of it, the complete comfort they seemed to have. It did not look like a mistake that had just happened spontaneously. It looked familiar, rehearsed, comfortable, like something that had existed long before. I walked through that door, and once they realized I was standing there, the panic that followed only confirmed everything my brain was trying not to believe. I remember my friend immediately trying to explain himself, speaking so fast that none of it even sounded coherent. My wife looked horrified, but not in the way I expected. It was less the horror of someone caught making one terrible decision and more the horror of someone watching years of lies suddenly explode at once. I did not yell the way most people probably would. I think I was too shocked for anger at first. Everything inside me went cold instead. It felt like my emotions had disconnected, entirely just so my mind could survive the moment. Oddly enough, the very first thing I thought about was not even the betrayal itself. My mind immediately went back years, earlier, to all those accusations she used to throw at me about the neighbor. Suddenly, every argument replayed differently in my head. Every paranoid question, every emotional outburst, every time she insisted I must secretly be cheating. It all sounded completely different now. What I originally believed was insecurity suddenly looked a lot more like guilt. After my friend left the apartment, the silence between us felt unbearable. I asked the obvious questions first, like how long it had been happening and why. But deep down, there was one question bothering me more than anything else. I asked her if she had already been cheating. During those years when she constantly accused me of being unfaithful with the neighbor, for a moment, she looked genuinely stunned that I connected the two situations together. Then she immediately denied it and swore the affair had started much later. The problem was that by that point, trust no longer existed. Once someone lies to your face long enough, even their honesty starts sounding suspicious. And unfortunately, there was one more terrifying possibility sitting quietly in the back of my mind the entire conversation. A possibility I hated myself for even thinking about. But after discovering the affair, I could not ignore it anymore. I needed certainty, even if certainty ended up hurting me even through. In the days that followed, everything felt like I was moving through a version of my own life that no longer belonged to me. The apartment didn't feel like home anymore. Conversations felt forced, and even simple daily routines like eating or sleeping became something I had to consciously push myself through. My wife tried to talk to me multiple times, usually starting with apologies that shifted into explanations and then into emotional breakdowns when she realized I wasn't responding the way she expected. But I wasn't angry in the explosive sense anymore. I was just detached, like something inside me had already shut down to protect itself from further damage. She kept insisting it wasn't what it looked like, that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything serious, and that it only happened recently after everything had already been falling apart between us. But every time she spoke, my mind kept replaying a different timeline entirely. I couldn't stop thinking about the years of accusations she had directed at me, the jealousy over the neighbor, the constant suspicion that I was doing something I wasn't. Now, those memories didn't feel random anymore. They felt like pieces of something I had missed the entire time, something that had been sitting in front of me without me realizing it. The mutual friend, on the other hand, disappeared from our lives almost immediately. There was no real conversation after that night, no explanation that could fix what had already been exposed. He tried reaching out once or twice, but I never responded. I didn't have the energy to hear justifications or apologies. That would not change anything. Some betrayals don't require long discussions to understand. Once you see them clearly, everything else becomes irrelevant noise. What hurt the most wasn't even the physical act itself. It was the realization that I had been defending a version of my reality that didn't actually exist. I had spent years believing I was the problem, years arguing against accusations I thought were irrational, only to eventually discover that the accusations had come from a place I never expected. That kind of realization doesn't just break trust in other people, it breaks your trust in your own judgment. Eventually, I asked for clarity again, even though part of me already knew I might not get a truthful answer. I needed to know whether anything had been happening during the earlier years, specifically during that long period when she was constantly accusing me of being unfaithful with the neighbor. I didn't ask it calmly this time. I asked it out of exhaustion because I felt like I had been carrying a question I couldn't set down anymore. She denied it again. Same answer, same insistence that everything had started later, that the accusations had been unrelated, that it was just insecurity and coincidence. But the way she avoided my eyes this time said more than her words did. There was no confidence in her denial anymore, only desperation. And that's when I realized something that made the entire situation even heavier. I was never going to get a version of the truth that felt complete. I could either accept what I was being told or accept the pattern I had already seen with my own eyes. Neither option felt good, but only one of them matched reality in a way I could actually understand. In the end, what I was left with wasn't just betrayal, it was uncertainty layered on top of betrayal. And that combination is what makes it stick with you long after everything else has ended. After everything settled into a strange kind of quiet, I realized the hardest part wasn't the confrontation or even the moment I found out the truth. It was what came after, when there was nothing left to react to. No more arguments, no more explanations, no more shock, just a constant, lingering silence that filled every corner of my life. We were still living in the same space for a while, but it no longer felt like a shared life. It felt like two people occupying the same place while existing in completely different worlds. Every conversation became minimal and transactional. We spoke about practical things, bills, schedules, basic necessities, but anything emotional felt impossible to reach without it collapsing into discomfort or avoidance. My wife tried, in her own way, to rebuild something between us. There were moments where she would bring up memories from the past, trying to remind me of better times, trying to anchor us back to what we used to be. But those memories didn't land the same way anymore. They felt distant, almost like they belonged to other people I used to know, rather than us. And every attempt to reconnect only highlighted how far apart we had drifted. I started spending more time alone, not out of anger, but because being around anyone else felt mentally exhausting. My thoughts kept looping back to everything that had happened, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, repetitive analysis of events I couldn't fully make peace with. I kept trying to understand where things actually went wrong, not just the affair itself, but everything leading up to it. The accusations, the paranoia, the tension that existed long before I ever had proof of anything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how distorted my perspective had been during those years. I had spent so much energy defending myself that I never stopped to question why the situation felt so extreme in the first place. At the time, I believed I was simply dealing with an insecure partner. Now, it felt more complicated than that, like there were emotional layers I had never been allowed to see clearly while I was inside the relationship. One of the most difficult realizations was accepting that I might never get a clean, fully satisfying explanation for everything. I kept waiting for a moment where everything would suddenly make sense, where all the contradictions would resolve into a clear story. But life doesn't really work that way. People don't always give complete honesty, especially when it forces them to confront versions of themselves they don't want to face. Eventually, I stopped asking the same questions over and over, not because I got answers, but because I realized I was using the questions as a way to delay moving forward. At some point, understanding stops being productive and just becomes another way of staying stuck in the past. The final shift didn't happen suddenly. It was slow, almost unnoticeable. One day I realized I was thinking about the situation slightly less than I had the day before. Then a week passed, and I didn't replay every detail as intensely. Then a month, where it still hurt, but it no longer controlled every thought I had. What stayed with me wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the lesson that came with it. The understanding that sometimes the reality you build in your head while trying to make sense of someone else's behavior can be just as misleading as the lies you're trying to uncover. And in the end, the only thing left to do was move forward with that awareness, even if some parts of the story would never feel fully resolved. In time, I made the decision that there was nothing left to gain from staying in that same environment, not because I suddenly had all the answers, but because I finally accepted that I didn't need them in order to move forward. Some situations don't end with clarity or closure. They end with exhaustion and the quiet understanding that continuing to search for perfect explanations only keeps you stuck in a loop that never resolves. We separated after that period. It wasn't a dramatic final argument or a single breaking point anymore. It was more like two people slowly realizing that whatever had once held them together had already been gone for a long time. There were practical conversations, arrangements, and difficult logistics, but emotionally, the ending had already happened long before anything was officially said out loud. Looking back, I don't think the most painful part was the betrayal itself. It was the way trust had been stretched and reshaped long before it ever broke, and how I didn't recognize what was happening until it was too late. The accusations, the jealousy, the shifting tension, it all made sense in a way I never wanted it to, not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a much larger story I had been unknowingly part of. Over time, I stopped trying to assign meaning to every detail. I stopped replaying conversations, looking for hidden clues or alternate interpretations. I stopped asking myself, how long or why, with the same urgency, because those questions didn't change the outcome anymore. They only kept me emotionally anchored to something that had already ended. What remained was a quieter kind of understanding, not forgiveness in a dramatic sense, and not anger either, but something in between. Acceptance of the fact that people are capable of contradictions, and that relationships can hold both genuine moments and deeply flawed ones at the same time. Two things can be true simultaneously. There were real memories, and there was also deception. One does not erase the other. Eventually, life began to feel normal again, not because everything was fixed, but because I stopped expecting it to be. The weight of constantly trying to make sense of the past slowly lifted, replaced by a simpler focus on rebuilding, day by day, without forcing meaning onto everything that had happened. And if there is any final takeaway from all of it, it's that trust is not just about believing someone. It's about what happens when that belief is repeatedly challenged, and whether it can survive what reality eventually reveals. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes the hardest part is realizing that the answer doesn't come with closure, only with time.